Hello viewers, Tim Poole here, editor of Gambling Insider and Gaming America, here for the latest episode of The Huddle. I'm with David Bretnitz, Vice President of Sales at Kambi. David, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Pleasure to have you on The Huddle. We're here to talk about sports betting, but also a lot of things tribal because we're at IGA 2025. When it comes to start off with Kambi and the companies you work with, what are the biggest opportunities right now in sports betting for tribes? And maybe as a follow-up question, what are the biggest challenges?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest advantages, or I think maybe one of the kind of things that tribes are looking forward to, is there's a lot more education, there's a lot more confidence with the tribes right now. And I think what that means for Kambi, I think what it also means for the tribes too, is they're more comfortable moving into the digital space, whereas it used to just be brick and mortar focused. It used to just be retail, land-based sports betting. But they've really started to look forward to, how do they operate online? What does that look like? Is that just on a tribal side of things, on their tribal lands within their premises, or is that statewide? And is that statewide mobile? What does that look like? And so those are some of the things that we're really starting to talk to those operators about. And I think it's a lot easier of a conversation this year than it has been in the past. Just because of their confidence in it, knowing that they can do it. And I think, the way we take a consultative approach, I think gives them even more confidence that we can help kind of, guide them through that process.
And in terms of the challenges that tribes may face, potentially maybe going online, especially maybe for some tribal operators who were, historically very kind of retail and land-based.
I think one of the biggest challenges for tribes is they see what a lot of the very large commercial operators are doing, and they think they have to do the same thing to be successful. And they really don't. I think it's really based off of their strategy. It's based off of what their communities rely on them for. And success can come in many different ways, and it's not one size fits all. I also think, too, you see kind of the proliferation of some of these other, different verticals as far as wagering goes, whether it's sweepstakes, whether it's DFS 2.0, some of these different groups trying to, kind of go around, regulations and so on and so forth. So I think that's certainly a challenge for them and a risk for them. And I think it also kind of brings them more to the table now to start considering what they're going to do online and how they participate.
Yeah, certainly those kind of prediction markets and DFS 2.0, that's been mentioned a lot this week at the show. But when it comes to how Kambi can work to help tribal operators, what do you do? First of all, when you work with tribal versus commercial, what are the kind of main differences when you're working with an operator?
Well, I think there's a lot of similarities. I mean, obviously relationships are king in any sort of, partnership. But I think with the tribes, the biggest thing is understanding what's important to them. It's a little bit different for commercial operators. A commercial operator, if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. They kind of go on and they, go do something else. For a tribe, they have very large communities and many different resources that they provide to those communities that are reliant on their success. And so they have to make sure they do it right. They have to make sure they have a partner that they trust. And so really taking that consultative approach from our side, education, obviously teaching them, educating them on how to, operate successfully. But even more so, I think just understanding what's important to them from the tribal side of things is really, I think, the first step. I mean, even before you consider the regulatory regime or anything of that nature, it's really understanding what their communities are about, who relies on them, and what their strategies and initiatives are.
Sure, yeah. So taking all that on board, in terms of specific kind of offerings or products, what are you offering to tribal operators?
Yeah, so I think the one thing with tribal operators, obviously there might be some specifics, or they might have, advantages with some sort of, on-premise wagering that they might be able to offer that you can't offer on the commercial side. But the one thing that we do is we want to make sure that our tribal operators have every tool and resource available to them, all the markets, events, and everything else, have the most competitive sportsbook so they can compete with the DraftKings, with the FanDuels of the world. And that's super important for us. And so we don't really draw that line on a tribal operator gets one thing, a commercial operator gets something else. I think it's how we approach those relationships that might be a little bit different. But as far as the product offering, we want to make sure they're able to go out there and compete. Otherwise, especially when you're in a state like California, obviously there's no sports betting here yet. But when that comes, they need to be able to compete with those brands. And they need to be able to have something that's competitive, engaging, and obviously gives them just as much of an opportunity to generate meaningful revenue as anyone else.
You mentioned that sports betting isn't here yet in California, and that's, of course, a big question that everyone wants to know the answer to. But in terms of maybe new legislation or new states, tribal or perhaps otherwise, but maybe mainly focusing on tribal, where do you see potentially the biggest opportunities or new areas geographically that we could be seeing kind of in the coming year or few months, that kind of thing?
Yes, I mean, there's a couple out there that are kind of, coming along. Oklahoma's still, I think, up for consideration at this point. I know Governor Stitt really does not want to do a whole lot of favors for the tribes right now. But they have a couple of bills that are going through the State House right now. Some that might be veto-proof, some that might, give them the ability to, put it in the hands of the people of Oklahoma. I think if that's the case, I think they have a lot better chance to get something through. I also think too, there's other things that are tied to that. Obviously, Oklahoma is very much a tribal-controlled state when it comes to gaming, but where some of those operators might be able to operate outside of Oklahoma. Some of them have ties to Texas and other things. And so, obviously Texas is a little bit further out, but it'll be interesting to see kind of where that goes. And I think we're also seeing, tribes kind of investigating what it looks like, for them to take advantage of the West Flagler decision that's specific to the Seminoles in Florida, in kind of that hub and spoke model. And so I think there's a lot of tribes in existing states that are evaluating what that might look like for them. So it'll be interesting to see kind of where that goes, and we've had some of those conversations as well to see how we may or may not be able to support them.
We've touched on a few things, even just like I said, kind of regulation, prospective new states, sweepstakes, DFS 2.0, the big talking points this week. But in terms of your conversations with people kind of maybe at panels or in meetings at IGA so far, what are the things that are being said? What are things that maybe operators are speaking to you about and that kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's obviously that risk of what do those other, verticals look like, and the threats that they, pose to the tribes. And I think it's also made them think a little bit more about a proactive approach potentially. And I think that's a good thing. I think, it's easy to just respond, to new legislation and say we don't necessarily want to do this. As I mentioned before, I think it kind of comes back to the education side of things. It comes back to tribal operators having more confidence to potentially do things on their own. And I think that helps to kind of combat some of those other things from the DFS 2.0, from the sweepstakes side of things, to where they can start to chart their own path. And I think that's important. And I think that's probably the best way to, defend against some of those other, verticals that are coming along. And, obviously tribes have done things the right way for many, many years. And, they abide by the legislation. They, support their communities. They support the states that they work within. And I think when you see some of these other groups come in trying to, circumvent that and go around, those regulations, I think that's difficult, whether it's tribal or commercial.
Yeah. I mean, it's a tough question. And as you say, you don't want tribes to be, and even commercial operators, to be punished for following the rules, for doing the right thing. But I mean, we might not have the answer to this because that's why everyone's talking about it. But how best to combat something like that? Is it perhaps, as you mentioned, the best approach to be proactive and kind of build an offering that's strong enough and maybe perhaps resilient against new threats like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe it's having a seat at the table. Maybe if there are these, different things like sweepstakes and everything else that's coming along, maybe it is their participation in it. I'm not exactly sure on that. I think that's up to the tribes on how they navigate that side of it. But I think the last thing you want to see is these different groups come in and go around the tribes, go around commercial operators that are participating in a regulatory manner on a daily basis, paying taxes, and working under, strict regulations, for others to be able to come in and not have that same requirement. So, yeah, I mean, whether it's participation, whether it's, going out there and launching things and combating that in a way that, benefits the tribes, I think that's the verdict's still out on what that looks like.
Got a couple more topics for you. I wanted to ask definitely about, it'd be remiss of me not to ask, especially Kambi's annual tribal sports betting report. Wanted to ask kind of what are the main findings there and what did Kambi learn?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things there is being able to take the actual data. I mean, there's a lot of competition in this space, right? And so people can come along and say, hey, we're the best. We got all this, nobody else matters kind of thing. I think when you can actually take the real data and share that with other tribes, the success that tribes are having with Kambi, I think that makes it less subjective. It puts kind of the proof out there, like here's the facts. And obviously, we have a great partner in Potawatomi, in Milwaukee. So what we asked them to do was look at, since launching your retail sports betting operations there, have you seen an uptick in food and beverage sales? Have you seen more visitation? Like, what has it meant for your database? And one of the biggest takeaways there is how much that database, the demographic within that database, the age has lowered as far as the players that they're trying to get and the interaction that they have. They talk about on NFL Sundays, where there's NFL games going on and being played, they have all these kiosks there and all these people coming to place their bets. They have their coffee shops, they have other cafes, other restaurants, and those venues are overwhelmed. And I think that's a big thing for them. One, being able to attract a new demographic to the property that they may not otherwise have the ability to interact with, being able to retain those customers. And then I think beyond that, just how much uplift they've seen on the food and beverage side of it. So it's not always just about the sports betting side of it, but what you can get out of it beyond that. And I think that's where it really creates value for tribes when they see an uplift across the rest of the property. I think that's a pretty big thing. And so, yeah, I think really just taking the actual data points, sharing that with other tribes, it builds confidence. And I think it also helps to, again, educate the tribal community on what they can expect going forward.
Yeah, that cross-pollination aspect is certainly fascinating. And I'm sure it kind of applies even just to the casino floor as well, an uptick in sports betting, greater level of gaming. A final area for a final question, looking ahead, always good to kind of end the Q&A, looking forward. Plans and goals for the rest of kind of 2025. We don't have to go 2026 just yet, but especially kind of with a tribal focus, what it can be looking to achieve?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things for us is really just understanding this kind of new landscape right now. I think we heard a lot yesterday about some of the commercial operators, who have the SGA, kind of consortium, that they're trying to bring forward. In California, what does that look like? For the tribes, what does that look like for Kambi? Some of these new jurisdictions as far as, the expansion within the tribal community. And then I think even beyond that, what does the hub and spoke model look like? What is the West Flagler decision? What sort of bearing does that have on new opportunities or expanding opportunities? To where some might just be retail now, but the ability to be able to go online. So I think further educating ourselves, at Kambi, but then also too, just better understanding where we fit into the, that evolving landscape, how we can best support those tribes. And I think for the rest of 2025, I think that's where we're going to be at. And then looking ahead, what does that look like here in California, elsewhere, and I think, we'll see kind of where that goes.
Yeah. Well, David, thanks very much for your time and best of luck with everything you're looking to achieve this year as well.
Yeah, appreciate it. Thank you for the opportunity.